My name is Serena Calloway. I am 34 years old. And on the morning of my own wedding, I sat in a bridal suite at the Harborview Grand Hotel in Charleston, South Carolina at 8:43 in the morning, wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress that had taken me 11 months to find. And I listened to my father tell me that he would not walk me down the aisle. He said it quietly. That was always the thing about Gerald Calloway. He never raised his voice, he considered that beneath him. He stood near the window in his morning suit, his silver cufflinks catching the early April light, and he spoke the way he always had, measured, final, as though the conversation were already over before it had properly begun. I've thought about it a great deal, he said, and I don't think it would be appropriate given everything. I asked him what everything meant. Your choices, Serena, your career, the way you've presented yourself to this family, to this community. I have a reputation in this city, and I cannot stand at that altar as though I endorse the path you've chosen. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, in front of the vanity mirror, my hair already pinned, my mascara already set. And I looked at his reflection in the glass, and I said nothing for a very long time. What he didn't know, what he could not possibly have imagined in the entire catalogue of things he believed he understood about me, was that sitting in the front row of that ceremony, wearing a charcoal gray suit and his signature gold tie pin, was James Whitfield. The James Whitfield, the man my father had been trying to get a meeting with for 18 months, the man whose signature on a single contract would have meant $4.2 million and a decade of sustained work for Callaway Industrial Solutions. The man who, for the past 14 months, had been my most important client, my most trusted professional mentor, and one of the very few people in my adult life who had looked at everything I was building in silence and told me, without hesitation, that it was remarkable. My father had been trying to reach James Whitfield through 3 separate brokers, 2 mutual acquaintances, and one very expensive charity gala ticket that he'd purchased specifically to get 5 minutes in the right room. He had gotten nowhere. James Whitfield was at my wedding because I had invited him. This is that story. To understand what happened on that morning, you have to understand what it meant to grow up as Gerald Calloway's daughter. Not his son. Not the heir he had planned for. The daughter. The second child. The one who was always in some unspoken register of his private accounting, slightly less than what he had ordered from the universe. Gerald Calloway was 63 years old on the morning of my wedding. He had built Callaway Industrial Solutions from a 2-person operation in a leased suite on Meeting Street into a firm that employed 41 people and generated revenues of just over $9 million a year. He had done this through will, through an almost architectural precision, and through a complete intolerance for anything he perceived as weakness or disorder. He was not a cruel man by the standards of men like him. He paid his employees fairly. He gave to the right charities. He sat in the 4th pew from the front at St. Michael's Episcopal every Sunday morning without exception, and he shook hands with the rector on the way out with the particular grip of a man who wants God and the congregation to understand he is serious about being there. He was, by every measure that Charleston's professional class used to evaluate a man, a success. But inside the walls of our home on Trad Street, a 3-story antebellum house with original heart pine floors and a walled garden my mother had planted before she left, my father operated by a different set of rules. His rules. Rules that were never written down, never explained, and somehow always your fault when you broke them. My brother Tyler was 38. He had joined Callaway Industrial directly after graduating from Clemson, started in operations, and was now the firm's vice president of client relations. Tyler was everything our father understood. He played golf with the right people. He wore the right shoes to the right dinners. He had married Diane Hartwell at 29 in a ceremony at Middleton Place that our father had spoken about at every significant family gathering for the following 4 years, as though the wedding were a credential Tyler had earned on behalf of the entire family. Tyler had 2 sons, Brooks, who was 7, and Carter, who was 5. Tyler drove the same model of Mercedes our father drove, in a slightly darker shade of silver, which I had always thought was the most precise portrait of their relationship that I could offer to anyone who asked. I was not Tyler. I had never been Tyler. I had spent my childhood understanding this the way you understand the arrangement of a room. Not because anyone described it to you, but because you navigated it every day and learned which corners to avoid. I had gone to the University of Virginia for business, which my father had approved of because the University of Virginia was the kind of institution whose name fit cleanly into the sentences he constructed about his family at professional dinners. I had come home after graduation and worked for Callaway Industrial for 3 years, which he had expected. I had sat in operations meetings and drafted vendor proposals and built a new assessment framework for supplier relationships that, in the second full year of implementation, saved the firm an estimated $240,000. My father had credited that result to Tyler at the firm's annual review dinner in front of the full staff. Tyler had not corrected him. I had said nothing. I had filed it. I left Callaway Industrial in the September of a year that I think of now as the year the ground solidified under me. I left not with anger, but with a plan that I had been building quietly for almost 11 months by the time I sat across from my father's mahogany desk on a Thursday morning and placed my resignation letter on its surface. He looked at it, then at me, the way he looked when I did something he had not authorized. With the flat, disappointed expression of a man encountering a minor but persistent administrative error. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," I said. And I left. I started Meridian Advisory Group in a 400-square-foot sublease on King Street with a second-hand desk I had found through a listing on a Friday evening, one confirmed client, and a business plan that filled 3 notebooks I had kept in my bedside drawer for nearly a year. My one client was a mid-sized logistics company out of Savannah, whose operations director I had met at a conference in Atlanta. The contract was worth $38,000 for 6 months of structured advisory work. It was not glamorous. It was not impressive by any standard my father would have recognized, but it was mine, and I had built it from nothing. And the morning I signed that first contract, I sat alone in that 400-square-foot office on King Street at 7:22 in the morning. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had crossed a threshold I would never walk back through. My father heard about Meridian within 2 weeks of its opening, because Charleston is not a large city in the ways that mattered to people like him. At Thanksgiving that year, he referred to my firm as Serena's Experiment. He said it with a mild smile, the way you reference something that you expect will resolve itself quietly. I smiled back. I said nothing. I counted that comment the way you count your steps when you are climbing a very long staircase in the dark. I put it away where I kept the others. Over the following 4 years, Meridian Advisory Group grew. Slowly at first, with the specific caution of a structure being built in a place where the ground has not been fully tested. Then with a momentum I had not fully anticipated. I hired 2 junior analysts in year 2, a move that frightened me in the way that all commitments frighten you when you are building something that only you can see the full shape of. In year 3, I brought on Priya Ramesh as our senior consultant. Priya was 44, 10 years older than me, and had walked away from a partnership track at a firm in Atlanta for reasons she explained to me in her interview with the precision of someone who had spent a long time being honest with herself about what she needed from her work. I respected that immediately. I hired her the same week. By the start of year 5, Meridian's annual revenues had crossed $1.8 million. We had 11 full-time employees and clients in 4 states. I had moved the office from King Street to a proper suite on Broad Street, 3 blocks from my father's building. I walked past his building every Tuesday and Thursday morning on my route to the office. I never stopped in. My father did not know the revenues. He did not know the growth trajectory, or the client list, or the size of the team. He knew only that I had a little company and that I came to family dinners and was polite and answered his questions about work with the minimum required information and never argued and never defended and never gave him anything to grip onto. I had understood, across decades of practice, that the only leverage he could not take from me was the leverage he didn't know existed. There were 3 moments in the years before my wedding that showed me, with precise clarity, exactly who my father was, in case I had ever, in a weak moment, let myself forget. The first was at a dinner at Tyler and Diane's house in Mount Pleasant in the October of almost 3 years before the wedding. Nathan and I had been together for 2 years. My father arrived with Patricia, his wife of 11 years, a genuinely pleasant woman who had made her separate peace long ago with Gerald's management of the family. and within the first 20 minutes, while we were all still standing in Tyler's kitchen with our drinks, my father turned to Nathan and said with a smile, "You're a patient man. Serena has always been the complicated one." The room moved on. Diane refilled glasses. Someone said something about the Hartwell cousins and the conversation shifted. But Nathan had heard it, and later in the car home, he asked me if I wanted to talk about it. I said no. I told him I was fine. He held my hand the rest of the drive. I looked out at the lights on the bridge over the Cooper River, and I thought about the filing system I had been maintaining in some deep and functional part of myself for most of my adult life. And I added that comment to it, and I closed the drawer. The second moment was in March, 2 years before the wedding, at the annual Callaway Industrial Client Appreciation Dinner at the Palmetto Club. I was not invited. I never was. But I heard about it 10 days later from a former colleague who still worked at the firm. She told me that during the evening's remarks, my father had referenced Tyler as the future of the business, and that when a guest asked about his daughter, he had said, "Serena went a different direction. We wish her well. We wish her well." I have thought about those 4 words many times since, the precise distance they created, the way they filed me under a different category, outside the frame of his ambition, as though I had emigrated to a country he had no plans to visit. I thought about them again on the morning of my wedding, sitting in front of that mirror. They did not hurt me the way they once might have. By then, those 4 words were simply evidence, and I had always been very careful with evidence. The third moment was 6 months before the wedding at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house on Trad Street. Nathan's parents, Richard and Carol Webb, had come to Charleston for the weekend. It was intended as a proper introduction for both families. I should have known better than to carry hope into that dining room. But there is a part of every person that goes on hoping in the face of all contrary data, and I had not yet fully excised that part of myself. I sat at the table where I had eaten 1,000 meals, and I watched my father describe, to Nathan's father Richard, the full history and trajectory of Callaway Industrial, the growth of the client base, and the shape of Tyler's succession plan for 40 unbroken minutes. Richard Webb was a genuinely kind man. He listened, he asked good questions, he was gracious in the way of a person who was raised to be. When he turned to me and said, "And Serena, I know you have your own firm, we'd love to hear more," my father answered before I could draw breath. "She has a small advisory business," he said. "Consulting work. It keeps her busy." I watched Nathan's jaw set. I watched Carol Webb look from my father to me with an expression I knew. The expression of a woman who understands exactly what is happening at a table and is furious and sorry for it in the same breath. "It's not small," Nathan said. He said it quietly, to the table. Then he looked at my father directly. "She has 14 employees. Her revenues last year were—" "Nathan," I said. He stopped. He looked at me. I shook my head. "Not here. Not like this. Not with these witnesses and this table and these crystal glasses, and my father sitting at the head of it with his hands folded, waiting to see what I would do." "Sorry," Nathan said. To me, not to my father. I looked at my father. "We should talk more about the Hartwell Foundation sponsorship, Dad. Carol was telling me earlier that Richard is on the board." I redirected the table. I moved the air. I held the seam. And I drove home that night in a silence that Nathan eventually broke by saying, very carefully, "Are you all right?" I said. "I'm deciding something." He said, "What are you deciding?" I said. "What the next chapter looks like." 3 weeks after that dinner, my father called me. He asked me to come to his office. I went on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:15, and I sat across from his mahogany desk while he told me, in his measured, already concluded way, that he felt it would be better for the optics, and for the integrity of what the Callaway name represented in the community, if he did not stand beside me at the altar. He suggested Tyler, or that I walk alone. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. "I'm trying to be honest." I sat in that chair for a long time after he finished. I looked at the framed photographs on his wall, his photograph with the governor, the firm's 20-year anniversary plaque in brushed silver, a photograph of Tyler at his wedding, standing with my father, both of them in morning suits, both of them looking directly at the camera with the easy confidence of men who have never doubted their place in the frame. I was not in a single image on that wall. I'd been in that office dozens of times over the years, and I had never noticed that before. Or I had noticed it and filed it and never let myself fully look at what the filing meant. "I'll think about it," I said. He nodded as though I had agreed. I walked out of Callaway Industrial Solutions for the last time onto the afternoon street, and I called Priya. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened in the precise, factual way that I tell Priya everything. There was a short silence on the line when I finished. Then she said, "Does he know about Whitfield yet?" I said no. She said, "Good. Don't tell him. Let me explain James Whitfield." James Whitfield was 67 years old. He had made his first significant capital in commercial real estate in Atlanta in the 1990s, his second in logistics technology in the 2000s, and had spent the decade before my wedding deploying that capital as a private investor in what he had described in the single long profile he had ever consented to give to a business publication as companies that are solving real problems with uncommon clarity of thought. He was not a man who took many meetings. He was not a man whose calls were returned because his assistants had been persistent. He moved when he chose to move, toward things he had identified through his own process of attention. And that process was not accessible to brokers or charity gala seating arrangements. He had found Meridian Advisory Group through a referral from a client of ours, a manufacturing firm in Savannah whose operations we had restructured over 18 months, producing a 22% reduction in operational overhead and a client retention outcome that the CEO had written about in an email to several colleagues in his network, including James Whitfield. Whitfield had called our office on a Wednesday morning in the February of 20 months before my wedding. Priya had taken the call. She had come to my office immediately after, closed the door, and said, with a particular evenness that meant the opposite of calm, "James Whitfield just called. He wants to speak with you." I had known who James Whitfield was. Every business professional in the Southeast with any relevant knowledge of the landscape knew who James Whitfield was. What I had not known in that moment was that my father had spent the previous 6 months attempting to reach him through a broker named Douglas Kane, through a mutual contact at the Coastal Carolina Business Alliance, and through the aforementioned charity gala ticket, and had been unsuccessful across all 3 channels. I found that out later from Patricia in one of our rare moments of unguarded conversation. She mentioned it almost in passing, the way she mentioned most things that she thought I should know but couldn't say directly. I called James Whitfield back at 2:37 that afternoon. We spoke for 41 minutes. He was direct and precise and genuinely curious about our methodology in a way that told me he had already done considerable reading before he picked up the phone. He asked intelligent, specific questions about our case selection process, our analytical framework, and what we did differently from the larger firms in our space. At the end of the call, he said, "I'd like to meet your team. Would next Thursday work?" He came to our office on Broad Street on a Thursday morning. He met Priya. He met Marcus, our senior analyst who had a tendency to present data in a way that made complex things feel inevitable in retrospect. James looked at 3 case studies we had prepared. He asked about our 5-year revenue trajectory and our client selection criteria and what we turned down. He was in the room for 2 hours and 17 minutes. When he stood to leave, he shook my hand with both of his and said, "You've built something real here. I want to be part of supporting it." Over the following 14 months, James Whitfield became Meridian's strategic investor. He was precise about the structure of his involvement. He did not want a controlling position, he said, because he was not in the business of controlling things he hadn't built. He took a minority stake, contributed to a structured growth fund for the firm, and brought 2 of his portfolio companies to us as new clients. In return, he sat on our informal advisory board, took my calls when I was working through something complex, and told me once over lunch at his preferred restaurant in Savannah, a quiet place with no menus on the tables, where he apparently came to think that in 40 years of evaluating companies and the people who built them, the ones who got it right were almost always the ones who had learned to build before anyone was paying attention. I had not told my father any of this. I had not told my father because there was no reason to. My father did not ask about my business in ways that opened the door to honest answers. He asked about it the way someone asks about the weather in a city they will never visit, with the social form of interest but without the underlying hunger to know. And because I had never mentioned James Whitfield to my father, and my father had never connected the name Meridian Advisory Group to the daughter whose company kept her busy. The connection had simply never surfaced. 2 separate worlds. Same city. No bridge. I want to be precise about this. I did not engineer the wedding invitation as a mechanism to humiliate my father. That is not who I am, and it is not how I think. Over the 14 months of working with James, he had become a genuine figure in my professional world and, quietly, in my personal one. He had met Nathan. He had asked about the wedding. He had said with complete sincerity that he would be honored to come. I had said I would be glad to have him. I had said I would be glad to have him. I had sent the invitation. That was the sum of it. It was only after my father's announcement in his office, after the silver cufflinks and the measured voice and we wish her well, and all its long antecedents, that I understood the full architecture of what was about to happen. And what I understood very clearly was that I had not built any of it for this moment. I had built it for me. But this moment was coming anyway, and I was not going to rearrange a single piece of the furniture to make it stop. If you are still watching this, I want you to stop for just a moment and drop a comment below. Tell me if you have ever been in a room with someone who defined you before they knew you, and you had to decide whether to fight them in that room or build something they couldn't argue with. Because that decision, the one I made in my father's office on that Tuesday afternoon, is one of the quietest and most consequential things I have ever done. If this story is landing somewhere real for you, subscribe before we get to what happens next. Because what happens next I did not plan, and I could not have written, and it is the truest thing I know about what it means to build something real. In the 4 months between that Tuesday in my father's office and my wedding day, I worked. That is the most honest summary I can give. I worked with the specific focus of someone who has understood, finally, that the work is not a consolation for the life. The work is the life. The work is the answer to every question that was ever asked about your capacity by someone who had already decided the answer. We closed the hospital system contract in early November, a 14-month engagement valued at $680,000 that would put Meridian's year-end revenues at just over $2.3 million, nearly 2/3 ahead of the previous year. I did not tell my father. I did not tell anyone in his circle. I came to work before anyone else arrived, and I left after Priya. And Priya was not an early departure. I ran on Tuesday and Thursday mornings along the riverfront at 5:50 in the morning, before the city had remembered it was awake, and I thought through every client relationship and every structural decision and every line of the growth fund agreement with James. And I thought about what I was building and what it meant, and what it was going to be in 5 years and 10 years, and whether the version of me that had walked out of my father's office on a September afternoon 7 years earlier would have believed any of it. She would not have believed it, and yet she had built it anyway. That is what I kept coming back to on those Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The building itself was the act of faith, not faith in the outcome. You cannot know the outcome, but faith in the next correct step, and then the one after that, and the one after that. I spoke to my father twice in those 4 months, once at a family dinner at Tyler's in November, and once on the phone in early December when he called about wedding logistics. Both conversations were civil and brief and contained nothing. Patricia pulled me aside at Tyler's dinner in the kitchen, while the men were in the living room discussing a deal Tyler had apparently nearly closed. She held my hands in both of hers and looked at me with the particular expression she used when she was saying something she couldn't afford to say at full volume. "I hope you know I don't agree with him," she said. "I want you to know that." I told her I knew. I told her it was all right. She looked at me for a long moment with something in her eyes that was not pity but was close to its better cousin. The thing you feel when you see someone carrying something heavy and carrying it with more grace than the weight deserves. She said, "You're so much stronger than he knows." I said, "I know." Nathan was extraordinary through all of it. He had wanted to confront my father the night I told him. I had watched him sit at our kitchen table with his palms flat on the wood and his jaw set, working through an impulse that was entirely justified and entirely his to manage. He had asked me what I wanted him to do. I told him the most important thing he could do was stand at the end of that aisle and mean what he said. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I always mean it." We had decided together that we would tell no one about my father's decision. Not his parents, not Camille, not Jade. We would let the morning arrive with no architecture around it and trust what I had built to speak. The morning of my wedding was a Saturday in April. I was awake at 4:50, not from nerves. I want to be clear about that. I slept well that night with a completeness of someone who has done everything that could be done and has released the rest. I was awake because that is what my body does when something significant is approaching. I lay in the dark for a few minutes and I thought about the first day I had walked into that sublease on King Street with a second-hand desk and one client and 3 notebooks full of plans that no one else had read. I thought about the Tuesday morning I had handed in my resignation and heard my father say I was making a mistake. I thought about Serena's experiment. I thought about we wish her well. I got up. I made coffee. I got dressed in the quiet of our bedroom while Nathan slept. And I thought about how far I had come from the dining room on Trad Street. And I thought about what it costs to build something true in the presence of someone who has decided in advance what you are worth. And I thought that the cost, in the end, was not as high as the cost of not building. I was in the bridal suite at the Harborview Grand by 7:15 with Priya, with Camille who had flown in from London, and with Jade who had driven up from Savannah the night before. My hair was done by 9. My dress was on by 9:35. My grandmother's pearl earrings went in last, as they always had when I wore them, and I sat at the vanity and looked at myself in the full light of that morning and felt, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, entirely and irreversibly myself. At 8:43 there was a knock at the suite door. It was Gerald Calloway. He had told Patricia he needed a moment with me. He came in and stood near the window and he said what he said. He said he had thought about it. He said it was about the optics, about his reputation in the community, about the message he would be sending. He said he was trying to be honest. I let him finish. I looked at him in the mirror, his silver cufflinks, his morning suit, the careful architecture of a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing a version of himself that required the right people to be in the right positions around him. I looked at him the way you look at something from a sufficient distance that its proportions finally become accurate, and I said calmly, without heat, without any of the weight I had been carrying for 7 years, "Okay." He blinked. He had expected something from me. Tears, or argument, or the performance of devastation that would confirm his centrality in the story. He was prepared for those things. He did not have a prepared response to this. "Okay," he said. "Thank you for telling me," I said. He stood there for a moment in the altered air of a room that had not given him what he came for. Then he said, "I do hope you have a beautiful day," and he left. Priya looked at me from across the room. The question in her eyes was not, "Are you all right?" She knew I was all right. The question was, "Are you ready?" I looked at her reflection and I nodded once. "Tell me when James arrives," I said. James Whitfield arrived at the Harborview Grand at 10:15 with Eleanor, his wife of 39 years. Priya texted me from the lobby. I read the text, set my phone face down on the vanity, and I sat for a moment in the particular silence that comes just before things become permanent. The ceremony was scheduled for 11. At 10:50, the venue coordinator came to say it was time. I walked to the top of the staircase above the entrance hall, where the processional began. The ceremony room doors were closed. The string quartet was already playing something that moved through the floor. I could hear the particular sound of 200 people gathered in a room before the thing they have gathered for begins. The low warmth of it, the contained anticipation. And then James was there. He had come to find me. I had not asked him. I want to be exact about this. I had arranged nothing. He saw me at the top of that staircase in my grandmother's pearls and my dress that had taken 11 months to find, and he walked toward me with the unhurried certainty of a man who has seen something that matters and knows exactly what to do. He knew. I had never told him about my father, not one word, not in 14 months of professional intimacy, and the particular candor that develops between two people who are trying to build something real together. But James Whitfield had built his entire career on reading rooms and reading people, and at some point in the preceding months, he had read mine. He stopped in front of me and he looked at me the way my father had never looked at me, with the full attention of someone who sees what is in front of them without the interference of what they need it to be. "Is there anyone with you?" he said. I said no, I was going to walk alone. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the closed doors. He looked back at me. And then he offered me his arm, with the simplicity of someone performing an act that requires no negotiation. "May I?" he said. I looked at him. I felt something settle in me that I had not known was still unsettled. I put my hand in the crook of his arm. "Thank you," I said. "It would be my honor," he said. The doors opened. I have tried many times to find the right words for what it felt like to walk through those doors. I have come back to this moment in my mind again and again since that April morning. The light through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The flowers I had chosen after weeks of looking. Nathan at the altar with his hands clasped and his eyes already finding mine across the length of the room, and his face doing that thing it does when he sees me. That specific, private rearrangement of his expression that I have never been able to fully describe but that I have never once misread. I knew what it looked like to my father. Priya told me later, with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail specifically so she could tell me accurately. She had been seated on the bride's side, third row from the front, with a direct line of sight across the aisle to the row where Gerald Calloway sat in his morning suit. She said he didn't register it immediately. He saw a figure beside me and processed it the way you process something that doesn't fit the frame you have prepared, with the short delay of the mind catching up to the eyes. Then recognition arrived. She said it moved across his face like a cold front. His expression did not collapse, he was too controlled for that, but it changed in a way that was unmistakable. He went still in a way that was different from the stillness of a man watching a ceremony. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, went flat against his leg. He looked from me to James and back to me. Then he looked at his own hands. He did not look up again for a long time. Other people noticed. Of course they did. Several of my father's professional associates from the Charleston business community were seated in the room, men who knew the name James Whitfield with the particular wariness of people who understand exactly what proximity to certain figures means. I was told later by two separate guests that a murmur moved through the room before I had reached the front. Nathan watched me come toward him and his expression did not change from the moment the doors opened. He watched me arrive and he watched James release my arm and offer his hand, and Nathan took it with both of his, and James said, quietly, "You're getting someone exceptional." Nathan said, "I know." The ceremony was 37 minutes. I stood at that altar and I said the things I meant, out loud, in front of 200 witnesses, and I heard the things I needed to hear. And I thought very briefly about the notebooks by my bedside and the King Street sublease and the one client and the 450 mornings and what it had cost and what it had built, and I thought, this is not the prize. This never was the prize. The prize was the building, every day of the building. And the building goes on after today, and it was going on before today, and it does not require anyone's endorsement to be real. The reception was in the garden room adjoining the ceremony space. Round tables, cream linens, the flowers I had finally decided on, a band that played things people actually got up and moved to. The late afternoon light came in through the tall glass and turned everything gold. I danced with Nathan. I talked with Richard and Carol Webb, who had driven down from Columbia and who embraced me the way people embrace you when they are truly glad about something. I talked with Camille, who cried more than I did, which felt right. I talked with Jade about the Atlanta office we had been discussing for Meridian, which made Priya, who was listening, give me a look of combined exasperation and pride that I would have framed if I could. At some point during the cocktail hour before the reception had fully opened, my father found James Whitfield. I was not there. I heard about it afterward from 3 separate witnesses, each of whom told me the same account, with small variations of emphasis. My father introduced himself. "Gerald Calloway," he said. "Calloway Industrial Solutions. We have some mutual contacts, I believe." James Whitfield looked at him. "I know who you are," he said. My father recognized the opening and stepped into it the way he had stepped into 1,000 professional openings over 30 years of building a business in this city. "I've been hoping to find an opportunity to discuss a possible alignment. I think there's real overlap between what Calloway Industrial does and the kinds of companies you tend to, Mr. Calloway," James said. His voice, by every account, was entirely pleasant and entirely final. "I've worked with your daughter for 14 months. She's one of the most rigorous, strategic minds I've encountered in 4 decades of working in this industry. I have a great deal of regard for what she's built." He paused. The pause was not long. It was precise. "I think you know why I won't be taking that meeting." He excused himself and walked toward Eleanor at the bar. My father stood where he was for a moment. Then he walked to the far edge of the garden room and sat down at an empty table near the window and did not move for approximately 20 minutes. Patricia found him there. She sat beside him and said something I will never know. I watched this from across the room where I was standing with Nathan's hand in mine and a glass of champagne I had barely touched. I did not go to him. I let it be. Later, near the end of the evening, at 8:57 by the clock on the garden room wall, the band playing something slow, Nathan at the bar with his father. My father came to find me. He appeared at the edge of the dance floor in his morning suit, and he looked uncertain in a way I had never seen on his face before. Not guilty. I do not think Gerald Calloway has ever fully inhabited guilt, but uncertain, as though the reliable coordinate system by which he navigated the world had shifted and he was standing in a place he did not recognize. "Serena," he said. I said, "Dad." He looked at me. He said, "I didn't know about your relationship with Whitfield." "No," I said, "you didn't. A beat. Then, you could have told me." I thought about that. I thought about it in the full light of everything it contained, the anniversary dinner and the dining room, and keeps her busy, and went a different direction, and Serena's experiment, and the vacant wall in his corner office. I thought about what it would have meant to bring him the news of Whitfield as a credential, as a thing to put on the wall, as evidence submitted in a case I had never agreed to be tried in. "I could have," I said, "but you never asked." I said it without heat, without satisfaction, without the performance of any emotion. I said it the way you state something that has been true for a very long time, and finally, simply, deserves to be said. He opened his mouth once and closed it. He looked at his hands the way he had looked at them during the ceremony. He said, "I think I may have been unfair to you." I said, "I think you may have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to try to do better." I looked at my father for a long time. I looked at the man who had built something real and was genuinely proud of it, and had never once extended the possibility of that pride to his own daughter. I looked at him without warmth and without coldness and without anything as simple as either. And I felt something that was not forgiveness and was not its absence. Something quieter and more honest than both of those. The feeling of a door that is neither opened nor locked but simply stands ajar in the changed air. "I'd like that too," I said. "But that's a longer conversation than tonight." He nodded. He excused himself. He and Patricia left before 10. I have thought about that evening many times in the months since, about what it means to arrive at a moment you did not engineer for the purpose of arriving there. I had not set out to win anything. I had not set out to humiliate anyone, or to vindicate myself, or to construct a moment in which the architecture of years of dismissal would collapse in front of witnesses. I had set out on a September morning 7 years before to build something true. And what I had found over 7 years of building was that truth has a way of declaring itself in its own time, on its own terms, with a precision that no plan could have managed. My father had spent 20 years giving me a version of myself that he found manageable, small, contained, legible, categorized under disappointing, and returned to his other work. And for years, some part of me had carried that version around like a coat I hadn't asked for but hadn't found the moment to put down. The years I spent building Meridian were, among many other things, the years I put that coat down. Not in front of him. Not with any theater. I set it down quietly in a 400-square-foot office on King Street on a morning when no one was watching, and I walked away from it, and I did not go back for it. The morning someone was watching turned out to be my wedding day, and what they saw was not a woman surviving the wreckage of her father's opinion. What they saw was a woman walking into the best chapter of her life on the arm of someone who knew exactly what she had built and considered it remarkable. That is the only revenge I was ever interested in. In the months since the wedding, my father and I have spoken several times. The conversations are careful and real in a way they have never been before, and I will tell you plainly that I do not know where they lead. He has not made a complete and specific accounting of what he owes me, and I am not waiting for one. He has tried in his limited and recalibrating way to be present in a manner he had not previously managed. Whether he succeeds at that is genuinely, for the first time in my life, not my primary concern. His becoming is his own work, not mine. I am not the architect of it, and I am not responsible for its outcome. And I have lived long enough with that particular burden to understand the relief of setting it down. Priya and I are in active conversations with 2 additional investors for a Series A round that would allow us to double the team and open the Atlanta office. Nathan and I bought a house in the Wagoner Terrace neighborhood, 3 miles from Trad Street, and a world away from the version of Charleston I grew up believing I had to justify myself inside. I run on Tuesday and Thursday mornings along the riverfront. I still wake at 4:50 when something important is approaching. I still keep notebooks by my bedside, and they are still full of plans that no one else has read yet. I still do not wait for permission. If you are someone who has spent years building in silence while someone nearby has already decided what you are worth, I want to say something to you that I needed to hear for a very long time, and didn't hear until I found my way to the other side of it. The building is the answer, not the argument. Not the confrontation. Not the moment when they finally see it and feel the full weight of what they had dismissed. Those moments may come, they may not, but they are not the point. They were never the point. The point is what you are becoming in the years before anyone is watching. The point is the notebooks and the early mornings and the one client and the absolute refusal, quiet and daily and unannounced, to let someone else's ceiling become your floor. Build it anyway. Build it in the hours when no one is taking notes, in the rooms that are too small and too cold and not yet what you need them to be. Build it with the people who see what you are seeing even when the rest of the room cannot. Build it so thoroughly and so honestly that when the light finally falls on it, what people see is not a comeback. What they see is something that was always there, fully formed and fully real, simply waiting for the room to go quiet enough to be heard. That is the only revenge worth having. If you are carrying something like this, a parent, a sibling, a partner who has defined you by what they needed you to be rather than what you are, I want to hear about it in the comments below. I want you to know you are not alone in that room, and you are not the sum of what they said about you in it. And if this story gave you something you needed today, please subscribe. We are here every week with more stories of women who built in silence and let the work do the talking. The loudest comebacks are built in silence. I know that now because I lived it, and I would not have changed a single quiet morning of it. To everyone who has watched this story all the way to the end, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. You brought your full attention to Serena's story, and that is not a small thing. This channel exists because of listeners like you who understand that some of the most powerful stories are the ones that were never meant to be loud. Every week we come back with a new voice, a new woman, a new chapter of something built in silence that finally gets to speak. If you felt something in this story today, a flicker of recognition, a breath you had been holding for a long time, then you are exactly who we make these stories for. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and come back next week. Your story, or someone's story that sounds exactly like yours, is on its way. We are so glad you're here with us.